Thank you for joining this journey of kindness, transformation, and true wealth. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. And stay tuned for more inspiring stories that remind us all of the power of generosity, resilience, and the unexpected ways lives can change. Let's get started today. Stories about millionaire pays homeless woman to have his baby. But what happens next will blow your mind. Jack Davis's desire for an heir. Jack Davis had everything that most people dream of. At 42 years old, he stood at the pinnacle of success, vast wealth, an empire built on meticulous decisions, an influence that stretched across industries. His life was a well-oiled machine, structured with precision, free from the chaos that so often accompanies human emotions. His mansion gleamed with opulence, filled with priceless art, fine furniture, and the kind of luxury that most could only fantasize about. On paper, Jack's life was perfect, yet he knew there was one thing that no amount of money could buy, something that had eluded him despite all his accomplishments. It was not love. No, Jack had long ago given up on that idea. It was not happiness, nor was it companionship. It was the simple, undeniable fact that he had no one to carry on his legacy. He wanted an heir. In a world that constantly demanded results, Jack had succeeded in nearly everything he set out to achieve. He had triumphed in business, built his wealth, and created a life that most could only dream of. Yet as he looked at the grand house that stood empty, its vast spaces echoing with silence, he knew something was missing. The laughter of children, the sound of a legacy being passed down through the generations, the sense of continuity that comes with knowing that everything you've worked for will carry on long after you're gone, these things were absent from his life. He needed an heir, someone to inherit not just his fortune, but everything he had meticulously crafted. But Jack's journey to parenthood would not follow the traditional path. He had been married twice, both times to women who had loved him deeply. But both marriages had ended in failure, leaving him disillusioned with the idea of love. He had come to believe that love was nothing more than an illusion, a fleeting emotion that only complicated matters. It made people weak, made them vulnerable, and Jack had no interest in vulnerability. Love brought with it expectations, disappointments, and heartbreak. And heartbreak, Jack was sure, was the one thing he could not afford. What he needed was a child, not a family, a child who would continue his name, his empire, someone who would be a part of him without the emotional entanglements that came with relationships. He could not afford the messiness of love, not when the stakes were so high. Jack knew what he wanted, a clear-cut agreement, a contract, a transaction. He was a businessman, and everything in his life had been governed by the same principles: efficiency, control, and results. In his mind, a child was simply another asset, a continuation of his legacy, a way to ensure that his name would live on long after his time had passed. The idea of a traditional family, with all its emotional complexities, held no appeal for Jack. He wasn't interested in a loving relationship with a partner, or the complications that came with building a life together. That path had led to disappointment twice before, and Jack wasn't about to make the same mistake again. He had no time for love, no patience for emotional drama. What he needed was an heir who would carry on his work without any of the emotional baggage. He knew that with his wealth, power, and influence, he could find someone who would accept his terms. After all, he was offering a way out for someone who might otherwise have little chance of ever escaping their own circumstances. Jack knew that the right person would accept his offer, an offer he knew would change their life forever, just as it would change his. The next morning, Jack drove through the city in his sleek sports car, his mind consumed by the idea of finding the right woman to carry his child. As he passed through the bustling streets, his gaze was drawn to a young woman sitting on the sidewalk. Her figure was small and thin, almost invisible in the sea of people rushing by. She was drawing on a piece of dirty paper, her messy brown hair falling over her face. Her blue eyes, despite their exhaustion, had a certain intensity, a spark of life that Jack found strangely captivating. She didn't seem to notice the world around her, lost in her drawing, as if nothing else mattered. Jack, initially dismissing her as just another person lost in the shadows of the city, continued to drive. But something nagged at him, pulling at his thoughts. He couldn't shake the image of the young woman on the sidewalk. It wasn't just her appearance that had caught his attention, but something in the way she seemed to exist outside of the world around her, as if untouched by the hustle and bustle of life. He had seen her, and that was enough to make him stop. Against his better judgment, Jack made a U-turn and went back to where he had seen her. When he stopped the car, he called out to her, his tone cold and direct. He wasn't in the mood for pleasantries or small talk, had a deal to propose. The woman, whose name was Sarah, looked at him with suspicion, sizing him up. She was wary, but she also knew she had little to lose. Jack's offer was Blonde wanted her to carry his child. There would be no emotional involvement, no relationships. In exchange, he would give her everything she needed: support, care, and a sum of money that would change her life. Jack was offering her an escape from the life she had known, a life of poverty and desperation. But it came at a price. Sarah, at first shocked by the absurdity of his proposal, hesitated. No one in their right mind would ever consider such an arrangement. But the more Jack spoke, the more she realized that the offer might be her only chance to leave behind the life she had come to accept as her fate. Jack made it clear that the terms were simple. She would carry his child, and once the baby was born, she would leave, free to live her life however she chose. There would be no emotional ties, no obligations, just a contract. Jack didn't want a family. He didn't want a partner or love or the complexities that came with those things. He wanted an heir, a child who would carry his blood and his name, who would inherit everything he had built. A legacy that would live on, even after he was gone. And for Jack, that was all that mattered. His search for an heir, however, would ultimately become more than a simple business transaction. He would discover that even the most carefully planned and controlled lives cannot account for the unpredictable nature of human emotions. And as he faced the complexities of becoming a father, Jack would come to realize that love, something he had once dismissed as unnecessary, was the one thing he needed most of all. For now, Jack had what he wanted: a contract, a child, and control. But the journey ahead would challenge everything he believed about life, legacy, and the very meaning of family. What began as a cold business deal would soon turn into something far more complex and deeply emotional than he ever expected. Sarah Bell's struggles. Sarah Bell's life had always been defined by survival. She was a woman accustomed to the harsh realities of the streets, where every day was a battle against hunger, cold, and the overwhelming feeling of invisibility. At 28, she had seen more hardship than most would in a lifetime. Her childhood had been marked by neglect, and her teenage years by rejection. When she was old enough to leave, there was nothing waiting for her in the world but an empty void. She learned to navigate through that void, to get by, to scrape together the fragments of a life that seemed to offer no promise. For Sarah, each day was just another day spent trying to survive, trying to keep herself from being swallowed by the darkness that seemed to follow her everywhere. She had tried to make sense of her existence, to find something that could give her life meaning. There had been fleeting moments of hope, like the time she had worked as a waitress for a few months, feeling the satisfaction of earning her own money, of being part of something more than just the invisible mass of homeless people she saw every day. But that too had been taken from her when the diner she worked at went out of business, leaving her once again without a steady job, without a place to stay, and once again forced to return to the streets. She had learned not to expect anything good from life, because the more she hoped, the more she was disappointed. The world was indifferent to her suffering. People walked past her every day, oblivious to the woman sitting on the corner with the dirty paper, clutching a pen in her hand as though it could provide her with some semblance of control over her life. She drew because it was the only way she could create something, anything, in a world that felt so out of her control. She drew to distract herself from the gnawing hunger in her stomach, from the cold that seeped into her bones every night as she lay on the pavement, waiting for the dawn to break. Drawing was the one thing that allowed her to forget, even for a moment, that she was nothing to the world but a nameless face in the crowd. Sarah had always kept to herself, wary of people and their intentions. She had seen enough to know that kindness often came with strings attached. She had learned not to trust, to remain distant and detached from anyone who might want to help her. Help often meant control, and she had no desire to be controlled. But as the days wore on, the hopelessness began to eat away at her resolve. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was running out of options, that she was reaching the point where there would be no way out, where she would be trapped in the same cycle of survival for the rest of her life. She had no family, no friends, no one who cared whether she lived or died. It was a brutal, lonely existence, and it was beginning to feel like there was no escape. She had resigned herself to this fate, knowing that the odds of changing anything were slim. And then, out of nowhere, came Jack Davis. He was everything Sarah was not: wealthy, powerful, confident, and completely in control of his life. He drove a sleek sports car and wore a tailored suit that spoke of a life far removed from the grime of the streets. When he first approached her, she was suspicious, wary of the sharp, calculating look in his eyes. People like him didn't come to the streets to offer help. They came for a reason that had nothing to do with kindness. But when Jack spoke to her, when he laid out his offer to carry his child in exchange for financial security, Sarah was caught off guard. It sounded absurd. It sounded like something out of a movie. A rich man wanting her, a homeless woman, to have his child. No strings attached, just a simple transaction. He would provide for her, support her through the pregnancy, and in return, she would give him what he wanted: an heir. The terms were clear. No love, no relationship, just a business arrangement. At first, she thought it was some kind of joke, a cruel joke. No one in their right mind would make such an offer. But Jack's demeanor was cold, detached, and most importantly, serious. He was offering her a way out of the life she had known for so long, a life of constant struggle and survival. Sarah's instincts screamed at her to walk away, to refuse, to hold on to the small amount of dignity she had left. But the offer lingered in her mind. For the first time in years, she was being given a choicean, actual choice. Jack's wealth and power could give her the freedom she had never had. She could escape the streets, live without fear of where her next meal would come from, without the terror of freezing to death in an alley. She could have a roof over her head, medical care, comfort. It sounded almost too good to be true. But what was the cost? She had no illusions about what this would mean. Carrying his child, handing it over once it was born, these were sacrifices she would have to make. It would be hers to give and hers to lose. But as Jack laid out the details of the deal, something inside Sarah shifted. The weight of her life, the burden of poverty, of loneliness, of feeling invisible to the world, all pressed on her. And for the first time in her life, she felt a sliver of hope, a sliver of possibility. Could this be her way out? Could she walk away from the life that had bound her for so long? The decision wasn't easy. It was a decision that went against everything she had ever believed in. It was a decision that forced her to question her own sense of self-worth. Could she really go through with it? Could she really bear a child for a man who saw her only as a vessel for his legacy? But as she considered the alternative, another night on the cold streets, another year of nothingness, the offer began to feel like the only way out. She didn't have much, but she did have one thing: the ability to carry life. In the end, it wasn't just the promise of money or comfort that swayed her. It was the need for something different, something better than the life she had been given. The need to escape the endless cycle of hardship. And so, she agreed. She signed the contract, agreeing to become a surrogate for a man who saw her as nothing more than a means to an end. It was a deal she had made with herself. She would survive, even if it meant sacrificing her dignity in the process. But what Sarah didn't know as she agreed to Jack's proposal was that this transaction would not be as simple as she thought. It would change her in ways she never anticipated, forcing her to confront the very things she had spent a lifetime avoiding: her emotions, her hopes, and the deep, buried desire to be seen, to be loved, to matter in a world that had forgotten her. This wasn't just a business deal. For Sarah, it would be the beginning of a journey that would test her in ways she never imagined. The agreement. When Sarah Bell agreed to Jack Davis's proposition, it felt like stepping into a world that was both foreign and familiar, a world where the rules of survival had shifted from the harsh realities of the streets to a polished, clinical form of control. For Sarah, the streets had always been a place of constant struggle, where survival was not just a daily goal, but an exhausting, relentless fight. Now, as she signed the contract that would bind her to Jack's offer, she felt a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. This wasn't the freedom she had imagined. It wasn't a return to her dignity. It wasn't the kind of life she had ever hoped for. Yet, it was an escape. The agreement itself was starkly simple in its terms. Jack had made it clear from the beginning: no emotions, no relationships, just a transaction. Sarah would carry his child. He would ensure her comfort and well-being throughout the pregnancy, providing her with all the necessities she needed to live without the burden of financial instability. When the child was born, she would hand it over to him, free to go wherever she wished, with the promise of a sum that would enable her to build a new life. It was clean, detached, and entirely businesslike. Sarah read the contract again, her eyes tracing the words that held the weight of her decision. Everything had been laid out: medical care, living arrangements, her access to whatever she needed during the pregnancy, and a substantial financial reward at the end of it all. There were no hidden clauses, no room for emotional involvement. The baby would be Jack's, and in exchange for this service, Sarah would receive a life that was unrecognizable to her current existence. As she signed her name at the bottom of the page, the reality of her situation began to settle in. The ink on the contract was permanent, but the consequences were far from simple. She wasn't just agreeing to carry a child. She was agreeing to sever a part of herself that she wasn't sure she could let go of. She was agreeing to allow herself to be a means to an end, to become a vessel for someone else's future, someone else's legacy. And that knowledge weighed heavily on her heart. There was a part of Sarah that still fought against the idea. She had spent so many years guarding her autonomy, her sense of self, that the notion of giving up such control, even for a better life, felt like a betrayal. But as she sat in the sterile, dimly lit room, Jack's voice echoed in her mind. His words, direct and without emotion, had painted this deal as nothing more than a matter of logistics, as though her role was nothing more than that of an employee fulfilling a job. She was just a necessary part of his plain and inconvenient but essential piece of the puzzle. His tone had been cold, calculated, and efficient, and as much as Sarah had despised that coldness, it was also what had drawn her in. Jack was a man who knew exactly what he wanted. He was a man who understood the value of control, of keeping emotions at arm's length. To him, this was a business transaction, an investment in his legacy. He wasn't interested in love, in the messy complications of human relationships. For Jack, emotions were liabilities. His wealth, his status, his achievements, all of these had been built through calculation and strategy. There was no room for weakness, no space for feelings that could cloud his decisions. Sarah, on the other hand, had learned the hard way that survival wasn't about control, it was about letting go of control, about surrendering to the whims of fate and hoping you'd live another day. Her life had never been planned, never structured. It had been a series of reactions to circumstances, of adapting to whatever the world threw her way. The idea of entering into an agreement like this, of trading her body for security, felt alien to everything she had ever known. And yet, here she was, signing away a part of her future for a promise of safety, for the hope of something better than the life she had been dealt. What struck Sarah most about the agreement, what made it feel even more like a betrayal of herself, was how easy Jack had made it seem. His confidence, his calm, his unwavering belief that this was the right thing to do it was all so compelling. There was no questioning, no hesitation in his voice. He had made it clear that he was doing this for his legacy, for the future of his name. For him, this was a transaction. But for Sarah, it was so much more. It was her body, her soul, her hope for something more than the streets. She was handing over something sacred, something that'd never be reclaimed. As the days passed and Sarah moved into Jack's mansion, the weight of the contract continued to settle on her shoulders. The mansion itself was a world apart from anything she had ever known. It was vast and cold, a symbol of wealth and isolation. Every room she entered felt distant, disconnected from the life she had once known. The marble floors, the grand staircases, the sparkling chandeliers, these things only reminded her of the gulf that separated her from Jack's world. She wasn't part of it. She was just a visitor, an outsider, waiting for the day she would leave with a sum of money and a part of her soul left behind. The contract had given her a life of comfort for the first time in years, but it had also stripped away her agency, her voice, her identity. Every decision made about her care, her treatment, her routine was made by someone else, someone who was not concerned with her well-being beyond the physical. Jack had arranged everything: the doctors, the food, the shelter. She had everything she needed, but she had nothing that was truly hers. She had no control over her own life. Even her emotions, the things she had long kept buried, began to rise to the surface in ways she couldn't control. She had been given comfort, but at what cost? Each day, she became more aware of the disparity between what she had been promised and what she was beginning to feel. The money, the medical care, the luxurious surroundings, they were all there, but they didn't fill the emptiness inside her. They couldn't replace the one thing she truly needed: the freedom to make her own choices, the power to determine her own future. Jack had given her comfort, but he had also taken her independence. The agreement was a contract, yes, but it was also a silent contract with herself. She had sold a part of herself in exchange for stability, but what had she gained in the process? Jack's involvement in her life remained distant, professional. There were no gestures of kindness, no moments of warmth. He was everything she had expected: cold, calculating, and focused only on the outcome. She was just a part of his plan, a step toward building his legacy. Yet, as the days passed, Sarah began to wonder if perhaps she had underestimated the complexity of this arrangement. Perhaps Jack was more than the businessman he appeared to be. Perhaps, deep down, he too was struggling with something more than just securing his future. Sarah's heart ached as she thought about the child growing inside her. It was a life she would have to give up, a future she would never see unfold. But what choice did she have? The contract had been signed. There was no going back. The deal had been made. And as much as she longed to keep the child, to love and protect it, she knew she couldn't. She had given up that right. All she had now was the promise of something better, something that might never be enough to fill the emptiness inside her. The agreement had changed Sarah's life, but not in the way she had hoped. It had given her stability, but it had also taken something precious, something she wasn't sure she could ever reclaim. As she continued with her life in Jack's mansion, the reality of what she had agreed to began to sink in. This was no longer just a contract. It was the beginning of a journey that would take her down a path she had never imagined, a journey that would force her to confront not just her future, but her very identity. The surprise of twins. The news came as a shock, a revelation that neither Sarah nor Jack had prepared for. It was a moment that would redefine everything they thought they understood about this arrangement. A moment that would forever alter the trajectory of their lives, though neither could yet comprehend the full extent of its impact. The ultrasound, which had been routine, had taken a turn when the doctor's voice, calm yet filled with something unspoken, echoed through the sterile, quiet room. "You're expecting twins?" The words hung in the air for a heartbeat before they sank in, settling heavy in the space between Sarah and Jack. 2 children. Not one, but 2 lives growing inside her. It was an idea that seemed impossible, a twist that felt like fate's irony, as if the universe had intervened to complicate an already complicated situation. Sarah had been trying to push her emotions to the back of her mind, to keep herself distanced from the life growing inside her, but now everything had changed. 2 hearts beating in unison, 2 sets of hands that would one day grasp at the world. The weight of it all came crashing down on her with a force she couldn't ignore. As she lay there on the examination table, her gaze fixed on the monitor in front of her, her mind struggled to catch up with what the doctor had just told her. 2 babies, twins. For a moment, she felt as though the world had tilted slightly, as if everything she thought she knew about her reality had shifted just enough to make her question everything. There was no longer just one future to let go of, there were 2. Jack, who had been standing silently by the door, stiffened when the words were spoken. Sarah could feel his presence behind her, always calculated, always distant, and yet in that moment she felt his attention sharpen, focused entirely on the screen. He leaned forward, a slight tremor in his posture that even he couldn't hide. For all his coldness, for all his calculated control, the sight of the 2 small, fragile figures on the screen seemed to break through his carefully constructed walls. There was no denying it now. This wasn't just a business deal anymore. This wasn't just an heir. This was something more, something beyond his grasp, beyond his plan. His eyes never left the screen, but Sarah could feel the tension in his body, the way he processed this new development, as if his mind was trying to piece together a puzzle he hadn't seen coming. He didn't speak immediately. He simply watched, taking in the image of the 2 tiny lives, each with their own distinct heartbeat, each with their own potential. Sarah couldn't read him, couldn't figure out what was going on in his mind. But she didn't need to. She could see the shift in him, the flicker of something unexpected. 2 babies. She had agreed to 1, but now there were 2. The thought of it overwhelmed her. She had been trying so hard to distance herself from this pregnancy, trying to keep her emotions in check, to see this as a transaction, nothing more. But now, as the realization of twins settled in, something inside her began to stir. She couldn't suppress it, couldn't push it down like she had done with every other feeling she had buried deep within herself. These were not just 2 cells, 2 heartbeats. These were babies. They were going to be real, and they were going to be hers, at least for a little while. The doctor continued with the examination, but the words were a blur to Sarah. She could only focus on the life growing inside her, the life that would soon be in her arms, the life she would have to hand over to Jack when the time came. The twins would have no idea of the circumstances of their birth, no idea of the agreement that had been made before they were even conceived. To them, she would be nothing but the woman who brought them into the world, the woman who had loved them for however brief a time they shared. And then they would be gone, taken away by a man who had promised her a future, but who never truly understood the depth of what it meant to care for a child. Jack finally spoke, his voice a low murmur, almost as if he was still processing the shock. 2, he repeated, the word lingering on his tongue. It was a question, an acknowledgement, but there was no excitement, no joy, just the recognition of a new reality he hadn't prepared for. "Two?" Sarah echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't know what else to say. She didn't know how to react. This wasn't part of the plan. In fact, it had never crossed her mind. She had been prepared to carry one child, to give birth to a single heir and then walk away. But this changed everything. And yet, what could she do? The contract had been signed. The decision had been made. She had no choice but to follow through, no choice but to carry these children, to give them life, and then to hand them over. The doctor reassured them that both babies were healthy, growing at the expected rate. But Sarah's mind couldn't focus on the medical details. She wasn't thinking about the health of the babies in the clinical sense. She was thinking about the emotional journey that lay ahead. The thought of carrying two children, of holding them, loving them, only to give them away. Could she do it? Could she love them knowing that she would have to say goodbye? Jack, for all his control, was a stranger to this world of raw emotion. He had never had to experience it. To him, the twins were an investment, part of his carefully orchestrated plan to secure his legacy. But Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the bond that would form between her and these children, the bond that was already beginning to take root. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how impossible it would be to let them go. That night, as Sarah lay in the enormous bed in her suite, the weight of the revelation pressed down on her. 2 babies, 2 heartbeats, 2 futures. She couldn't shake the image of them. So small, so fragile, their lives still unwritten. And yet, Sarah couldn't deny the connection she was already starting to feel. The thought of holding them in her arms, of watching them grow, of seeing them laugh and cry, it was all too much to bear. She wanted them. She already wanted them, but she knew she couldn't keep them. For Jack, the news of twins was a complication he hadn't expected. But in the days that followed, something shifted within him. He began to show up more frequently, asking Sarah about her appointments, how she was feeling. His detachment seemed to soften, and though he never openly expressed it, she could see the change in him. The idea of having 2 children, his own flesh and blood, had begun to take root in him as well. He wasn't just getting an heir anymore. He was becoming a father, and that realization was starting to affect him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The twins, though still in the early stages of development, had already begun to reshape everything. What had started as a cold, transactional agreement had evolved into something more complex, something that neither Sarah nor Jack could ignore. The future they had both imagined for themselves had just been altered irrevocably, and neither of them knew what the outcome would be. All they knew was that these twins, these 2 tiny lives, had already changed everything. In the quiet of the night, as Sarah lay awake, the sound of her own heartbeat seemed to echo in her ears, mingling with the distant rhythm of 2 lives growing inside her. The twins were no longer just a business transaction, they were her children, and no matter how much she tried to suppress it, no matter how much she tried to convince herself otherwise, she had already begun to love them. And in that love, the true complexity of the situation began to unfold. The twins were not just part of Jack's legacy, they were part of her story now too. And no matter what came next, she would carry that truth with her forever. Changing dynamics. As the months passed, the nature of Sarah and Jack's relationship began to shift in ways neither of them had anticipated. What had started as a sterile, almost transactional arrangement between a businessman and a woman desperate for a way out had evolved into something more complicated. It was subtle at first, a small gesture here, a moment of unexpected vulnerability there, but over time, those moments began to add up, changing the very foundation of their connection. Neither of them could quite define it, but they could both feel it. A shift from simple convenience to something more emotional, something neither of them had planned for. At first, Jack had been the embodiment of control. He had built his life on the principles of efficiency, power, and emotional distance. His offer to Sarah had been just another deal, another investment in his future, no different from any business transaction he had made throughout his life. He didn't expect to feel anything for the woman carrying his child. He didn't expect to feel anything at all. To him, this was about creating an heir, about securing his legacy, nothing more, nothing less. But as Sarah's pregnancy progressed, Jack's rigid walls began to show cracks. It wasn't any grand gesture that made him pause. There were no dramatic outbursts, no moments of sudden revelation. It was much more subtle than that. It was in the way he began to ask about her well-being during her doctor visits. It was in the way he would show up unannounced, just to make sure she was comfortable, just to check on her without an agenda. It was in the silence that sometimes hung between them. A silence that was no longer uncomfortable but pregnant, with something neither of them knew how to name. For Sarah, the change was even harder to grasp. She had entered this agreement with a clear understanding. She would carry Jack's child, hand it over, and walk away. The idea of emotions of connection was something she had pushed aside. She couldn't afford to get attached. She had never allowed herself to feel much in her life. Love, kindness, and affection were foreign concepts to her, things that had been withheld from her since childhood. She had learned to survive, to remain detached, because detachment was the only way to protect herself from a world that had constantly let her down. But as her pregnancy deepened, as the life inside her grew stronger, it became increasingly difficult to maintain that distance. She had always been fiercely independent, never relying on anyone for anything. But the moment she felt those small kicks, the moment she saw the first ultrasound images, something inside her stirred. She began to wonder if perhaps she wasn't as immune to connection as she had believed. These were her children, after all. 2 tiny lives, growing stronger every day. No matter how much she told herself to remain detached, she couldn't ignore the bond that was forming between them. And then there was Jack. Over time, she noticed the subtle changes in him. He wasn't the same man who had first approached her with that cold, detached proposition. He didn't talk to her like she was just a surrogate anymore. There was a quiet kind of tenderness in his voice when he asked about her comfort, the way he would occasionally check in to see how she was doing. It wasn't grand, it wasn't obvious, but there was something in the way he looked at her, something that spoke of a complexity he had never allowed himself to show before. Jack, for the first time in a long time, was being human, not the businessman who had it all figured out. For Sarah, the realization came slowly. She had been so focused on surviving, on getting through this ordeal with as little emotional attachment as possible, that she hadn't fully processed the ways in which Jack's involvement had started to matter to her. She noticed the small things, the way he opened the car door for her, the brief but meaningful conversations they had during the rare moments when they weren't focused on the business aspect of the pregnancy. It was these moments, small and almost imperceptible, that began to chip away at the walls Sarah had carefully built around her heart. She found herself thinking about him more, wondering what lay beneath the surface of the man who had been so cold, so calculating in the beginning. Jack's demeanor also began to change in response to Sarah's growing presence in his life. The man who had been so certain of his own control, who had prided himself on never letting anything or anyone disrupt his plans, was now finding himself caught in a situation he hadn't anticipated. The twins were not just a legacy for him anymore. They were his children. And that, in itself, was something he had never considered, never allowed himself to truly feel. But the more he saw Sarah, the more he saw her as a mother carrying his children, the more he began to realize that he wasn't just involved in a business deal anymore. This was real. These were his children. And even though he had told himself that he wanted nothing more than a bloodline, a continuation of his empire, he couldn't ignore the stirring of something deeper within him. In the quiet moments of the day, when he found himself alone with Sarah, Jack would sometimes catch himself wondering how it had come to this show. A simple arrangement had turned into something far more complicated. He had told himself that this was just about creating an heir, but as the months passed, he realized that he had never truly understood what it meant to be a father, to care for someone in the way that Sarah would care for the children. And that, perhaps more than anything, unsettled him. Sarah noticed the changes in Jack, the way his questions seemed to carry more weight now, the way his concern for her had turned into something more genuine. It made her uneasy at times. She wasn't sure she was ready for this kind of complexity, for the emotional vulnerability that Jack was beginning to display. But she couldn't deny it. It wasn't just the pregnancy that was changing her. It was him. And so, as the days turned into weeks and the weeks turned into months, the dynamic between them grew. There were no more cold, business-like conversations. No more discussions that were strictly transactional. Instead, they started to communicate on a different level that neither had expected. They began to share moments of vulnerability, of uncertainty, of fear for the future. It was uncharted territory for both of them. For Sarah, it was learning to open up to someone, even if just a little, and for Jack, it was learning what it meant to care for someone without a plan, without control. The night before Sarah went into labor, Jack stayed with her longer than usual. He didn't have anything to say. They simply sat in the quiet, the tension between them thick with unspoken words. Sarah could feel the weight of his gaze on her, but it wasn't calculating anymore. It was soft, almost uncertain, as though he was waiting for something from her. For once, there were no plans, no expectations. Just two people, connected by something that neither of them fully understood, but both felt in their bones. As the twins' birth approached, Sarah found herself torn between the love she felt for them and the reality of what she had agreed to. She had always known that she would have to give them up, but as the time drew closer, she couldn't help but feel the weight of that decision in a way she never had before. And Jack, who had once been so detached, was now fully aware of what it meant to be a parent. He didn't just want heirs. He wanted these children. He wanted them in a way he had never imagined. Their changing dynamic, once a simple business transaction, had grown into something far more complicated, a connection that neither of them could escape. And as the twins made their way into the world, both Sarah and Jack would find that the future they had planned for had been irrevocably altered. What had begun as a sterile arrangement had blossomed into a bond neither had expected, but both now could no longer ignore. Breaking the contract, the day Sarah had been dreading, had finally arrived the day she was supposed to leave. She had made her decision, the one she had promised herself she would make when the twins were born. She had always known this moment would come. The contract had been signed. There were no loopholes, no hidden clauses. Jack had kept his word, just as she had kept hers. He had provided for her during the pregnancy, ensured her comfort, and now, as promised, she was to walk away with the financial reward that would allow her to build a new life, far from the painful memories of the streets. But as Sarah stood in the doorway of her room, suitcase in hand, ready to leave the mansion that had been her home for the past several months, something inside her stirred. The decision that had seemed so simple when she first agreed to the arrangement was now a bitter pill to swallow. The twins were no longer just Jack's heirs. They were her children, too. She had carried them for 9 months, felt them grow inside her, and in the moments when she had held them, when she had whispered to them in the quiet of the night, she had felt a love so profound. It had shaken her to her core. How could she leave them? How could she simply walk away, knowing they would grow up without her? Jack had given her the life she had never dreamed of: comfort, security, freedom from the constant struggle for survival. But in return, she had given up something irreplaceable: the right to be a mother to the children she had brought into the world. She had promised herself that she would leave the mansion, that she would take the money and start fresh. She had thought she could do it. She had convinced herself that walking away from the children would be easier if she treated it as just another transaction. But she couldn't. No matter how hard she tried, the love she felt for the twins couldn't be undone. It was no longer just about the contract. It was about them. As Sarah walked down the grand staircase, her footsteps echoing in the hollow silence of the mansion, she found Jack waiting for her in the foyer. He stood by the door, his back straight, his expression unreadable. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the weight of the situation hanging heavily between them. Sarah wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. She had always been good at keeping her emotions locked away, at suppressing what she felt. But now, as she faced Jack, the dam she had built around herself began to crack. Jack was the first to speak, his voice low but firm. "Are you really going to leave?" The question, simple as it was, felt like a heavy blow. He didn't sound angry or resentful, just resigned. It was as if he had known this moment was coming, but still couldn't bring himself to fully accept it. "I've done what I agreed to do," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She had told herself over and over that this was the right thing to do, that she would walk away without looking back. But now, standing in front of Jack, with the twins' cribs still in the nursery, she realized just how impossible that was. Jack took a step closer to her, his gaze unwavering. "The contract is over," he said, his words calculated, his tone detached. "You've fulfilled your part. You've done what you promised. Now it's time for you to leave, just like we agreed." His eyes softened, just for a moment, before he looked away, breaking the brief, fleeting connection that had passed between them. Sarah felt a pang of guilt in her chest. She had known this was how it would go. There were no emotional attachments, no room for sentiment. She had been paid, the terms had been met, and now it was time to leave. It was supposed to be simple, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was being torn from her, that she was leaving behind more than just the mansion and the comfort it provided. She was leaving behind her children. Jack was a businessman, first and foremost. He had made the offer out of necessity, a desire to secure his legacy. The twins were just another part of his plan. But Sarah knew, deep down, that he hadn't anticipated the emotions that would surface as the pregnancy progressed. She had seen the way his gaze softened when he looked at the twins, the way he began to ask about her health, about how she was feeling. He had never expected to care. He had never intended to feel anything for her, for the children, but somehow it had happened, and now she could see it in his eyes. He wasn't just losing a transaction. He was losing something much more important. The connection that had grown between them, the unexpected bond that neither had planned for. But Sarah wasn't sure what she was supposed to do with that. She wasn't sure what any of it meant. She had entered this arrangement with a clear understanding. No emotions, no relationships, just a simple exchange. But as she stood there, facing Jack, the clarity she had once felt was gone. The terms had been simple, but the reality was messy, complicated, and filled with emotions neither of them knew how to handle. "I can't leave them," Sarah said, her voice shaking with the emotion she had tried so hard to suppress. "I can't just walk away from them, Jack. They're my children, too." Her heart was pounding in her chest, and the tears she had been holding back threatened to spill over. She had thought she could do it. She had thought she could walk away, take the money, and start a new life. But now, as she stood there, facing the man who had once been so cold, so detached, she realized just how much she had changed. Jack's expression softened, and for the first time, he seemed unsure of himself. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but then stopped. The silence between them grew heavy, filled with the weight of their unspoken feelings. For the first time, Jack didn't seem like the man who had orchestrated everything with such precision. He seemed like a man who had discovered something about himself he wasn't ready to admit. "I never expected it to be like this," Jack said, his voice low. He wasn't looking at her now, but at the floor as if searching for the right words. I thought this was just about legacy, about continuing my name. But now, I don't know. I don't know what I feel anymore. Sarah stared at him, her heart torn in two. I can't just give them away, Jack. They're mine too. I carried them. I loved them. And now, you want me to walk away like it's nothing. Jack looked up, his eyes meeting hers with a mixture of guilt and something else, something deeper, something raw. I never meant for it to happen this way, he said quietly. But I can't change the past, and neither can you. For a moment, Sarah wondered if she was making a mistake. She wondered if the world she had fought so hard to leave was still the one that would always define her. She had promised herself that she would be strong, that she would do this for her future. But the thought of walking away from the twins, of giving them up to a man who had once seen them as nothing more than a part of his plan, felt like a betrayal she couldn't live with. And in that moment, something inside her broke. She couldn't go. She couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when she had come to realize that the connection she had with the twins, with Jack, was more than just a transaction. It was something real. It was something worth fighting for. Forget the contract, Sarah said, her voice trembling but resolute. Forget everything we agreed to. I'm not leaving, not like this. Jack stood frozen, staring at her as if the ground beneath him had shifted. For the first time, he saw her not as a surrogate, not as a business arrangement, but as a woman, as a mother. And in that moment, Jack realized that the contract they had both signed had never accounted for the complexity of human emotions, and now it was too late to walk away from that. Becoming a family. The transition from an agreement to a family was neither swift nor easy for Sarah and Jack. What had begun as a cold, calculated transaction between two people who sought to fulfill their own needs without expectation of connection had somehow blossomed into something deeper, something neither of them had anticipated. Neither had set out for this outcome, but as time wore on, they found themselves pulled into a shared reality that was more profound than either had planned. When Sarah first entered Jack's life, it was with clear and firm boundaries. She was a woman on the edge of desperation, agreeing to carry Jack's child in exchange for a life free from the struggles of poverty, hunger, and uncertainty. Jack, on the other hand, had been motivated by the cold logic of securing his legacy, creating an heir who would inherit everything he had built. Neither of them had anticipated the emotional complexity that would evolve as they spent months together, connected by the life growing inside Sarah. The first shift had been small. Jack began showing concern for Sarah's well-being. It started with simple check-in shows she was feeling, how the pregnancy was progressing. He wasn't asking because he felt obligated. He wasn't doing it out of a sense of duty. There was an authenticity to his questions that surprised them both. It was subtle at first, a man who had built his life around control, now stepping into the unknown, caring for a woman who had once been a stranger, who was now carrying his children. His questions, once businesslike and formal, began to soften. There was something human in his voice when he asked how she was doing, when he showed up unannounced, just to make sure everything was okay. For the first time, Jack wasn't trying to control the situation. He was simply present, sharing in the quiet moments that come with the fragile reality of new life. For Sarah, the change was harder to accept. She had spent years protecting herself from any real emotional connection. She had learned early on to keep herself distant, to guard her heart, because caring for anyone had always meant vulnerability, something she could never afford. But as the weeks passed, as she felt the babies grow inside her, something shifted within her. She had never imagined herself as a mother, never considered that the act of carrying a child could change the course of her life so completely. Yet, with every movement of the twins, with every flutter of tiny life inside her, Sarah found herself becoming more and more connected to them. She had never felt love like this before. It wasn't just an emotional attachment. It was a physical one, deep and primal. These children, who had begun as part of a contract, were now a part of her, and she wasn't sure she could ever truly give them up. But even as Sarah grappled with the bond she felt with her unborn children, she noticed Jack's own subtle transformation. The man who had once treated this entire arrangement as a simple business transaction began to show signs of something more. There was a tenderness in the way he looked at her during doctor's visits, the way he spoke about the babies. He would occasionally ask about the twins' development, about how Sarah was feeling, about the things that made her comfortable or uncomfortable. He didn't ask these questions because it was part of the agreement. He asked because, whether he liked it or not, he was starting to care. One night, after a particularly difficult doctor's appointment, Jack found Sarah alone in the garden, gazing up at the sky, her hands resting lightly on her swollen belly. It was a quiet evening, the air thick with a kind of silence that makes everything feel suspended, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Jack stood at a distance for a moment, watching her, unsure of how to approach. It was becoming harder for him to ignore the feelings that had started to emerge, feelings he didn't know how to deal with. This wasn't just about an heir anymore. The twins weren't just a continuation of his bloodline. They were real. They were human. And Sarah, who had once been a distant figure, now seemed impossibly close to him, as if the connection between them had deepened in ways he didn't understand. "I didn't expect this," he said finally, his voice soft. "I didn't expect to care." Sarah turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Neither did I," she replied, her voice steady, but filled with emotion. For a moment, there was silence again, but it was different from the earlier silence. It wasn't the emptiness of detachment. It was a silence filled with the weight of shared understanding. Both of them had gone into this arrangement thinking they knew exactly what it would entail. They both thought they could keep it simple, controlled. And yet, here they were, caught in something much more complicated, something much deeper than either had imagined. As the days passed, their dynamic continued to evolve. Jack found himself spending more time with Sarah, engaging in conversations that were less about logistics and more about life. He was learning about her past, her fears, her dreams. Sarah, in turn, found herself opening up in ways she never thought possible. She wasn't used to letting anyone in, but there was something about Jack's quiet presence, the way he had shifted from distant and cold to something more vulnerable, that made her feel like she wasn't entirely alone in this. For the first time in years, she felt as though someone truly saw her not as a surrogate or a means to an end, but as a person, a woman who had her own worth and value. And through it all, the twins continued to grow, an undeniable presence in both of their lives. As Sarah's due date approached, Jack became more involved in the preparations, asking about baby names, preparing the nursery, and even spending time researching parenting techniques. The man who had once seen parenthood as an inconvenient obligation was now doing everything he could to ensure that the twins would have the best possible start in life. By the time the twins were born, Sarah and Jack had transformed from two strangers bound by a contract to something more a family, though neither of them would have used that word just yet. But in the days and weeks that followed the birth, the transformation became undeniable. Jack, for the first time in his life, was not just a businessman, he was a father. And Sarah, though still uncertain of her place in this new reality, was learning to accept the love she had never thought she would feel. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the easy, picture-perfect family that many dreamed of. There were still complications, still moments of doubt and fear. But there was love. Real love, built not on the foundation of a contract, but on the bond they had forged through shared experience, through the birth of two beautiful children who had brought them together in a way neither had expected. As Sarah watched Jack hold the twins in his arms, something inside her softened. She had always been afraid of what love could do, afraid of how vulnerable it made her. But now, As she saw the tenderness with which Jack held their children, the care in his eyes, she realized that love was not a weakness. It was the strength that bound them together, the force that had turned a cold arrangement into something warm and beautiful. They were a family now. Not because they had planned it, but because they had found each other in the most unexpected of places. And as they moved forward, with the twins at the center of it all, Sarah knew that love would be the one thing that would guide them through whatever came next. The power of love and change. Love is often portrayed as an emotion that transforms people, but rarely do we stop to consider just how powerful it can be to unravel the walls that we've spent years building around our hearts. For Sarah and Jack, the power of love wasn't a fairy tale, it was a slow, quiet force that had seeped into their lives, changing them in ways they never expected, reshaping not just their relationship with each other but their understanding of themselves. It was the kind of change that felt like both a gentle awakening and a hard-won battle, and neither of them had been prepared for it. Sarah had entered this arrangement with Jack with her walls high, fortified by years of struggle and pain. She had never believed that love could be a real, lasting thing. For her, it had always been something fleeting, something that people with security and stability could afford, but not someone like her. She had learned the hard way that love often came with loss, and loss was something she couldn't bear to face again. She had become numb to the idea of affection, convinced that survival was all she could focus on. So, when she agreed to carry Jack's child, she did so with the understanding that this would be nothing more than a transaction. Her heart would remain untouchable. She would survive, and that was enough. Jack, too, had approached the arrangement with the same cold, logical mindset. A man who had everything money could buy but lacked something more fundamental in heir to inherit his legacy. His first marriages had ended in disillusionment, and after that, he had shut himself off from emotional attachment. Love had been a complication he wasn't willing to deal with, especially when it could cloud his goals and ambitions. So, when he made the offer to Sarah, it was all about control. A child, a legacy, an heir to secure the future of everything he had worked for. He never imagined that the process of creating a family, of bringing life into the world, would change him in ways he couldn't predict. As the months of Sarah's pregnancy passed, something began to stir in both of them. For Sarah, it started with the small, fleeting moments, the first time she felt the baby's kick, the first time she saw their ultrasound images, and the way her heart softened when she held the twins after they were born. Each moment deepened her connection to them, and though she had once been determined to walk away, she couldn't deny the bond that had formed. The twins weren't just a part of the agreement anymore. They were her children. No contract, no promise could sever that. Jack, too, was changed in subtle but profound ways. His initial detachment slowly gave way to something more vulnerable. When he first looked at his children, he hadn't expected to feel the depth of emotion that overtook him. The strength of his desire to protect them, to ensure their well-being, surprised him. And as he spent more time with Sarah, as their lives became more intertwined, he began to see her not as a woman he had hired for a task, but as a partner, a mother who had carried his children, and someone who had brought a softness to his life that he had never allowed himself to experience before. It was in the small things, when he gently touched Sarah's hand during doctor's visits, when he asked her how she was feeling, when he began to spend more time with the twins, learning what it meant to care for them. For the first time in his life, Jack realized that love wasn't something that weakened him. It was what made everything he had built meaningful. The power of love in their lives wasn't just about the affection between them or the connection to the twins. It was about what love revealed, their vulnerabilities, their fears, and the parts of themselves they had hidden for so long. Sarah, who had once guarded her heart with every ounce of strength she had, found herself opening up to Jack, slowly allowing him to see the parts of her she had hidden from the world. She began to trust him in ways she never had before. Her strength, once built on independence and survival, now became a shared strength, rooted in love and connection. She learned that love wasn't a weakness, but a force that could empower her to face the future. For Jack, the power of love was no less profound. He had always been a man who prided himself on control, on the ability to dictate his life and the world around him. But love was a force that couldn't be controlled. It crept into his heart, challenging everything he thought he knew about himself. He had spent his life focusing on building his empire, on creating a future that was secure and predictable. But in loving Sarah and the twins, he realized the things worth fighting for, the things that truly mattered, couldn't be controlled. Love had a way of breaking down the walls he had carefully built around his heart. It made him see that, no matter how much he tried to stay detached, there was no escaping the truth. He was capable of more than just ambition. He was capable of love, and in loving Sarah and the twins, he had found something far more important than power or legacy. But love also brought change, and that change was not always easy. It wasn't a fairy tale. The path to becoming a family wasn't smooth. There were moments of doubt, moments when both Sarah and Jack questioned their decisions and wondered if they had made a mistake. For Sarah, it was the fear of losing herself in the role of mother, of becoming someone she never intended to be. For Jack, it was the fear of being too vulnerable, of allowing someone into his life in a way he had never allowed before. But what they both realized as they moved through those difficult moments was that love was not about perfection. It was about growth, about becoming something more than they had ever imagined, and about understanding that the journey to building a family was filled with its own complexities and challenges. As they navigated this new reality, Sarah and Jack found themselves not just caring for the twins, but for each other in a way they never expected. They became partners in every sense of the word, their lives intertwined in a way that went beyond the initial contract. Their love for the twins had bridged the gap between them, but it was their love for each other that had truly transformed them. They were no longer two people bound by an agreement. They were a family. And that transformation was not just about the babies or the life they had built together. It was about the realization that love could change even the most rigid, guarded hearts. For Sarah, the realization came when she watched Jack hold their children. His face softened with love and care. She saw the man he had become, a man who had once been a stranger to love, now fully invested in the future of the family they had created together. For Jack, it came when he realized that love was not about control, but about connection, about being vulnerable and open to the unpredictable, messy, beautiful journey that came with it. He wasn't just building an empire anymore. He was building a family that was rooted in love, even if it hadn't started that way. The power of love had shown them both that change was possible, that even the hardest, most guarded hearts could be opened, and that love was a force stronger than any plan, any contract, or any fear. It was love that had transformed them, love that had made them a family. And though their journey had been unexpected, they knew that the power of love would continue to guide them through whatever came next. It had changed them forever. And for the first time, they were ready to embrace that change. In the end, Sarah and Jack's journey wasn't just about a business transaction, but about the unforeseen power of connection, vulnerability, and love. What began as a cold, calculated arrangement between two people who thought they could control every aspect of their lives slowly transformed into something much more profound. Sarah, who had spent her life surviving on the margins, learned to open her heart, to trust again, and to embrace the possibility of love, even in the most unexpected of circumstances. Jack, a man once determined to protect himself from emotional pain, discovered that love could not be controlled or predicted, but that it had the power to transform him into something more human, more real. Through the birth of the twins, both of them learned that even the most carefully constructed plans could be altered by the unexpected end, that the greatest gifts in life often come in the form of vulnerability and connection. The story of Sarah and Jack teaches us that life is rarely as simple as we make it. We often go through life with rigid expectations and plans, believing we can control everything. But the truth is, love and change can alter the course of our lives in ways we never anticipated. The key is to be open to those changes, to allow ourselves to feel, and to let go of the idea that we need to control everything to be happy. Sometimes, it's in the moments of vulnerability and uncertainty that we find the truest connections and the most profound personal growth. Just as Sarah and Jack discovered, real fulfillment comes not from adhering strictly to our plans, but from being open to the unexpected, embracing love, compassion, and human connection in all its complexity. In our own lives, it's important to remember that our plans are just one part of the story. Letting go of control and allowing ourselves to experience life with an open heart can lead us to a deeper, richer understanding of ourselves and the people we share our lives with. Thank you for joining this journey of kindness, transformation, and true wealth if this story moved you. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. And stay tuned for more inspiring stories that remind us all of the power of generosity, resilience, and the unexpected ways lives can change. See you next time.